The rain came down in sheets over the empty stretch of road outside Ravenswood territory, and Elena Voss lay in the mud, with her hands shaking too hard to hold her phone steady. Her ribs ached with every breath, her vision blurred at the edges. Somewhere behind her, the sound of a car engine faded into the distance, taking with it the man she had once called her mate. Damon had not looked back. She had known, deep down, that this day would come. She had felt it building for months, in every cold word, every dismissed request, every time he chose his ambitions over her well-being. Tonight he had finally said what he truly thought of her, right before he left her on the side of the road and drove away without a second glance. The words still echoed in her mind, sharper than the pain in her body. Worthless, a burden, nothing. She pressed her palm against the wet gravel and tried to push herself up, but her arms would not cooperate. The forest around her was dark and unfamiliar, the kind of dark that swallowed sound and light alike. No cars had passed in the last 20 minutes. No one was coming. She was, for the first time in her life, completely and utterly alone. Her phone screen glowed faintly in her hand, cracked from where she had fallen. She stared at it, feeling the last thread of hope inside her grow thin. She thought of her sister, Sophie, who was 3 towns away and would not learn what happened until it was too late to matter. She thought of her parents, gone years ago, who would never know how far she had fallen since they died. She thought about how strange it was that in the final moments of her strength, all she wanted was for someone, anyone, to know that she had tried. That was when she remembered the number. Weeks earlier, while cleaning out an old storage room in the Ravenswood pack house, she had found a torn page from a ledger, yellowed with age, tucked behind a loose board. On it was scrawled a single line in fading ink. Kane Whitlock, Alpha of Blackthorn, emergency contact only. She had no idea why the page existed, or why it had been hidden, but she had taken a photo of it out of curiosity, the way she saved odd little things she found in her life, small mysteries that gave her something to think about besides her own unhappiness. She had never called the number. She had never even considered it. Blackthorn was a rival pack, powerful and distant, its alpha, a man she had only heard of in whispered stories. But now, lying in the mud with her strength fading and no one else to turn to, the memory of that photograph rose up in her mind, like a lifeline thrown into dark water. Her fingers trembled as she opened her gallery and found the image. She squinted through the pane and typed the number into a new message, her thumbs slipping twice before she managed to get it right. She did not think about what she would say. She did not think about who might read it, or whether they would care. She only knew that she needed to leave something behind, some small proof that she had existed and had tried to survive. The message was short. If anyone finds this, tell them I tried. I am sorry I was not strong enough. She pressed send before she could change her mind, and then the phone slipped from her fingers into the mud beside her. Her eyes fluttered closed. The last thing she felt was the cold rain on her face, and the strange, quiet peace of having nothing left to fight for. Nearly 40 miles away, in the great stone hall of Blackthorn territory, Kane Whitlock sat across a long wooden table from 3 men he did not trust, negotiating the terms of a hunting boundary that had caused tension between packs for the better part of a year. He was not a man who enjoyed these meetings. He preferred the open air, the discipline of training his warriors, the quiet satisfaction of walking his land at dawn and knowing every tree and stream belonged to a pack that trusted him completely. But leadership required patience for things he did not love, and so he sat, arms crossed, listening to arguments he had already heard a dozen times before. It was Garrett, his beta and closest friend since childhood, who first noticed the shift in Kane's expression. They had grown up together, trained together, bled together in more fights than either cared to count, and Garrett knew every version of Kane's silence. This one was different. Kane's jaw had tightened. His eyes had gone distant, fixed on nothing, the way they did only when something ancient and instinctive stirred inside him. Kane's phone buzzed once in his pocket. He almost ignored it. He rarely checked his phone during pack business, and the number that appeared on the screen was unfamiliar, a string of digits with no name attached. Under normal circumstances, he would have silenced it and returned to the negotiation. But something made him glance down, some pull he could not explain, an itch beneath his skin that felt less like curiosity and more like instinct sounding an alarm. He read the message once, then he read it again. If anyone finds this, tell them I tried. I am sorry I was not strong enough. The words hit him like a blow to the chest, though he could not say why a message from a stranger should affect him at all. He had received threats before, insults, empty warnings from rival packs trying to unsettle him. This was none of those things. This was raw and quiet and final, the kind of message a person sent only when they believed no one was listening anymore. His wolf, usually a calm and steady presence beneath the surface of his mind, surged forward with a sudden violent urgency that startled him. It was not simple concern. It was recognition, deep and undeniable, the kind of pull that legends described but that Cain, at 34 years old and long past believing in fated bonds, had never actually felt. He stood so abruptly that his chair scraped loudly against the stone floor, cutting off the man mid-sentence across the table. The room fell silent. Garrett rose halfway from his seat, already reading the tension in Cain's shoulders. "Alpha," Garrett said carefully. "Is something wrong?" Cain did not answer immediately. He was staring at the number on his screen, as though it might vanish if he looked away. Something was wrong. That much he knew with absolute certainty, though he could not explain how he knew it, or why the certainty felt less like logic and more like something written into his bones. He typed a reply with fingers that were not quite steady. "Who is this? Where are you? Please answer." No response came. He waited 10 seconds, then 20. The silence stretched unbearably, each passing moment feeling heavier than the last. He called the number directly, listening as it rang once, twice, 5 times, before going to an automated voicemail that told him nothing at all. Garrett had crossed the room by then, standing beside him, his expression sharpening as he read the tension radiating off his alpha. "Cain, what happened?" "I do not know," Cain admitted, and the honesty of it unsettled him more than he expected. "Someone sent me a message. A stranger. It sounded like a goodbye." Garrett frowned. "A prank. A wrong number." Cain shook his head slowly, his eyes still fixed on the screen. It did not feel like a prank. It felt real. He paused, searching for words to describe the sensation clawing at his chest, a feeling utterly foreign to a man who prided himself on control. "Something inside me is telling me this matters, that I cannot ignore it." The other men at the table exchanged uncertain glances, unused to seeing their alpha so visibly shaken. Cain barely registered them. His mind was already working through the practical steps required to trace an unknown number, the kind of task his pack handled routinely for security purposes, though never with this particular urgency humming beneath his skin. He turned to Garrett. "Get Lucas. Tell him to trace this number through every contact we have, every resource, immediately. I want a location within the hour." Garrett studied him for a long moment, clearly weighing whether to question the order or simply follow it. In the end, loyalty won out over curiosity, as it always did between them. He nodded once and left the hall at a fast walk, already reaching for his own phone. The negotiation at the table dissolved without anyone formally ending it. The remaining men, sensing that their alpha's attention had left the room entirely, gathered their papers in awkward silence and excused themselves, promising to reconvene another day. Cain barely noticed them go. He remained standing at the head of the table, staring at the phone in his hand, as though it held the answer to a question he had not yet learned to ask. He thought about the message again. "If anyone finds this, tell them I tried." There was something in the phrasing that struck him deeply, a kind of exhausted resignation that spoke of pain endured for far too long without anyone noticing. He did not know this person. He did not know their name, their face, their story. And yet the thought of that message being the last word someone ever wrote filled him with a dread so sharp it nearly stole the breath from his lungs. 20 minutes later, Lucas arrived in the hall, breathless from having run the length of the compound. He was young, barely 26, but sharp as any tracker twice his age, and Cain trusted him with matters that required speed and discretion. In his hand he held a tablet, the screen already displaying a map with a small blinking marker near the edge of Ravenswood territory. "We found something," Lucas said, holding out the tablet. "The number is registered under a woman named Elena Voss. She is listed as a member of the Ravenswood pack. Her last known location, based on the signal, places her along the old forest road near the eastern border, close to where Ravenswood territory meets open land." Cain took the tablet, studying the small blinking dot with an intensity that made Lucas take an involuntary step back. Ravenswood, Kane repeated quietly. That territory belongs to Alpha Damon Ashford. He is her mate, according to pack records, Lucas confirmed, hesitating slightly before continuing. There is no indication of why she would be sending a message like that to an unfamiliar number this far outside her own territory. Kane's grip on the tablet tightened until his knuckles paled. Something in him, something ancient and instinctive that he had spent his entire adult life keeping carefully controlled, began to burn with an urgency he had never experienced before. He did not understand it fully, not yet, but he understood enough to know that every second spent standing still was a second that might cost this stranger her life. "Assemble a team," he said, his voice low and hard. "6 of our fastest. We leave immediately." Garrett, who had returned to the hall in time to hear the order, frowned deeply. "Alpha, that location is well within Ravenswood territory. If we cross that border uninvited, especially with an armed team, Ashford will see it as an act of aggression. It could undo months of careful diplomacy." "I do not care," Kane said, and the finality in his voice left no room for argument. "Someone is dying out there, Garrett. I felt it the moment I read that message, and I have never felt anything like it in my life. If Ashford wants to accuse me of overstepping, he can bring his complaint to me directly, once we have made certain his own packmate is still breathing." Garrett studied his friend for a long moment, searching his face for the calm, calculated leader he had always known. What he found instead was something rawer, something driven by instinct rather than strategy, and it told him more than words ever could about the seriousness of the situation. He nodded once, already turning to relay the order. Within minutes, 6 warriors stood ready at the edge of the compound, and Kane led them out into the rain, without waiting for the full team to assemble weapons or supplies. Every instinct in his body screamed that time was the only resource that mattered now, and he intended to spend every last second of it running. The forest between Blackthorn and Ravenswood territory was thick and old, the kind of woodland that had stood untouched for generations, its canopy so dense that even the storm above seemed muffled beneath the branches. Kane ran at the front of the group, his enhanced senses stretched to their limit, searching for any trace of the woman whose message had lodged itself so completely into his mind that he could think of nothing else. Rain soaked through his clothes within minutes, but he barely registered the discomfort. His focus had narrowed to a single point, a compass needle spinning towards something he could not yet see, but felt with absolute certainty was there, waiting, fading, running out of time. Garrett kept pace beside him, glancing over every few minutes with quiet concern. "You are certain about this?" "I am certain of nothing except that I have to find her," Kane replied without slowing. "That has to be enough for now." They crossed into Ravenswood territory without ceremony, moving low and fast through the undergrowth, careful to avoid open trails where border patrols might spot them. Kane knew the risk he was taking. An unannounced incursion into another pack's land was, by every rule of their world, a serious offense, one that could spark conflict between territories that had spent years maintaining an uneasy peace. He knew all of this, and in that moment, none of it mattered to him at all. The eastern road, when they finally reached it, was empty and slick with rain, stretching in either direction until it disappeared into darkness. For a terrible moment, Kane feared they had come too far, or not far enough, that the tracking signal had led them to the wrong stretch of forgotten pavement. Then Lucas, moving several yards ahead, went suddenly still, his hand raised in a silent signal. "There," he said quietly, along the shoulder of the road. Kane's heart seemed to stop entirely as he followed the direction of Lucas's outstretched hand. A shape lay motionless in the mud near the tree line, barely visible in the dim light, so still that for one horrifying instant he believed they had arrived too late. He was moving, before conscious thought caught up with instinct, closing the distance in seconds, dropping to his knees beside her, without any regard for the mud soaking through his clothes. Up close, he could see her clearly for the first time, a young woman with dark hair plastered against a pale face, her clothes torn and stained, her body curled in on itself as though she had tried, in her final moments, to make herself as small as possible. "Elena," he said, though he had no way of knowing yet that the name suited her, that it was hers. He pressed 2 fingers gently against her throat, and relief so overwhelming it nearly buckled him swept through his chest, when he found a pulse, faint but steady, beating beneath his fingertips. "She is alive," he called back to the others, his voice rough with an emotion he did not have time to examine. "Get Priya. Now." Behind him, the team scrambled into motion, someone reaching for a communication device to summon the pack healer, someone else moving to form a protective perimeter around them, in case Ravenswood patrols appeared. Kane barely noticed any of it. His entire world had narrowed to the fragile weight of the woman in front of him, to the shallow rise and fall of her chest, to the strange and undeniable pull he felt radiating from her skin the moment his fingers made contact. It struck him like lightning, sudden and impossible to ignore, a recognition that ran deeper than logic or reason. He had heard old stories of it his entire life, had dismissed most of them as folklore meant to comfort young wolves anxious about their futures. He had never expected to feel it himself, certainly not like this, not kneeling in the mud beside a stranger whose name he had learned only moments before from a torn ledger page, and a desperate message meant for no one in particular. "Mate," his wolf whispered, low and certain, a single word that changed everything. Kane gathered her carefully into his arms, mindful of the injuries he could see, and the ones he suspected he could not, and rose to his feet with her weight cradled gently against his chest. She did not stir, her head falling naturally into the curve of his shoulder, and something in him, something that had been closed off and guarded for longer than he cared to admit, cracked open at the sight of her stillness. "We are leaving," he said to his team, his voice steady now despite the storm raging inside him. "Immediately. And if anyone from Ravenswood tries to stop us, they will have to go through me first." No one argued. Garrett fell into step beside him without a word, his own expression grim with understanding, and together they began the long run back toward Blackthorn territory, carrying with them a woman none of them yet fully understood, but whom Kane already knew, with a certainty that defied explanation. He would move heaven and earth to protect. The rain continued to fall around them, softening as they moved deeper into the trees, as though the storm itself sensed that the worst of the night had already passed. Kane held Elena close, watching her face for any sign of waking, and made a silent vow that whoever had done this to her would answer for it, one way or another, no matter what rules of pack law or diplomacy stood in the way. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Kane Whitlock, Alpha of Blackthorn, felt something other than the calm and measured control he had built his entire reputation upon. He felt fear, sharp and immediate, for a life that had somehow, in the space of a single message, become inseparable from his own. And beneath that fear, quieter but unmistakable, he felt the first fragile stirrings of hope that whatever had brought them together on that rain-soaked road was only the beginning of a story neither of them had chosen, but both of them, in ways they did not yet understand, desperately needed. The healer's quarters at Blackthorn territory smelled of dried herbs and clean linen, a small stone building set apart from the main hall, kept warm by a fire that never seemed to go out. Priya had worked as the pack's healer for nearly 15 years, and in that time she had treated broken bones, deep wounds, and every manner of injury that came with life among wolves who trained hard and fought harder. Even so, when Kane carried Elena through the door and laid her carefully on the examination table, Priya's practiced calm faltered for just a moment at the sight of the bruises mapping the young woman's arms and torso, some fresh, others clearly weeks old, layered over one another like a record of suffering endured in silence. Kane stood at the edge of the room, unwilling to leave, his presence filling the small space with a tension that made even Priya's assistants move carefully around him. He had not let go of Elena's hand until the moment Priya insisted she needed room to work, and even then he retreated only a few steps, arms crossed tightly over his chest, eyes fixed on every movement Priya made. "She will live," Priya said after a thorough examination, glancing up at Kane with an expression that mixed relief and quiet anger. "Her injuries are serious, but nothing that will not heal with rest and proper care. She is dehydrated, exhausted, and her body has been under a great deal of strain for a long time, not just tonight." Kane's jaw tightened. "What do you mean, not just tonight?" Priya hesitated, choosing her words carefully, aware of how volatile her alpha's mood had become in the last hour. "Some of these injuries are old, Kane. Weeks old. Some even older than that. Whatever brought her to that road tonight was not an isolated event. This appears to be part of a much longer pattern." The words settled over Kane like a physical weight. He had suspected as much from the moment he read her message, from the exhausted resignation buried in every word, but hearing it, confirmed by someone with Priya's experience, made the reality of it impossible to ignore. He thought of Damon Ashford, the alpha of Ravenswood, a man he had met only a handful of times at territorial gatherings, always polished, always composed, always careful to present himself as a reasonable leader. The thought that such a man might be responsible for what lay before him now filled Kane with a cold and steady rage, unlike anything he had felt in years. He forced himself to breathe evenly, aware that his wolf was pressing close to the surface, agitated by the scent of pain and fear still clinging to Elena's skin. Losing control now would help no one. What she needs, he decided, was patience, safety, and time. 3 things he intended to give her without hesitation or condition. "Will she wake soon?" he asked. "Likely within the next few hours," Priya said. "Her body needs to rest, but the deeper wounds are not physical. Those will take much longer to heal, and they will not respond to anything I can offer her here. She will need patience, and she will need to feel safe before she can begin to trust that safety is real." Kane nodded slowly, filing the words away with the same seriousness he gave to matters of territory and defense. "She stays here," he said. "In my quarters, where I can watch over her personally, until she is strong enough to decide what she wants for herself." Priya raised an eyebrow slightly at that, though she said nothing about the implications of the offer. She had served this pack long enough to recognize the signs of a bond forming, the particular focus in an alpha's eyes, when instinct overruled logic, and she suspected that whatever Kane had felt on that roadside went far beyond simple concern for a stranger's welfare. She kept her observations to herself for now, understanding that Elena would need time before anyone forced her to confront the complexity of what had happened to her that night. Hours passed slowly in the quiet room. Kane remained nearby throughout, occasionally stepping out to handle urgent pack matters that could not wait, but always returning within minutes, unable to stay away for long. Garrett found him there in the late afternoon, standing at the window with his arms crossed, watching the fading light outside, as though it held answers he desperately needed. "You have not eaten since this morning," Garrett said, setting a plate of food on a nearby table that Kane made no move to touch. "Nor slept, from the look of you." "I am fine," Kane said, though the words carried little conviction. Garrett studied his friend for a long moment before speaking again, his voice gentler than usual. "Kane, I have known you since we were boys learning to fight in the training yard. I have seen you calm during battle, steady during crisis, and unshaken through negotiations that would have broken lesser men. I have never seen you like this." Kane did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost uncertain, a tone Garrett rarely heard from him. "I felt something the moment I touched her, Garrett. Something I cannot explain, and do not fully understand myself. I know how it sounds. I have spent years telling younger wolves in this pack that the old stories about fated bonds are exaggerated, that most mates find each other through choice and time, rather than sudden recognition. And yet here I am, having known this woman for less than a day, unable to imagine leaving her side." Garrett was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "It happens," he said eventually. "Rare, but it happens. My own grandparents spoke of something similar, though I always assumed it was more legend than truth." He paused, studying Kane's face. "What will you do?" "I do not know yet," Kane admitted. "But I know I will not send her back to whatever she was living through. Whatever comes next, she will have a choice in it, something it seems she was denied for far too long." As evening settled over the compound, a soft sound from the bed drew Kane's attention immediately. Elena's eyes fluttered open, confusion and fear flooding her expression, as she took in the unfamiliar room, the unfamiliar faces, the distinct absence of anything she recognized as home. She tried to sit up too quickly, wincing at the pain that shot through her ribs, and Kane was at her side in an instant, careful to keep enough distance that he would not startle her further. "You are safe," he said, keeping his voice low and even. "No one here will hurt you. Please, try not to move too quickly. Your body needs time to heal." Elena stared at him, wide-eyed and clearly disoriented, her breathing quick and shallow. "Where am I?" she managed to ask, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Who are you?" "My name is Kane," he said simply. "You are in Blackthorn territory. You sent a message to my phone last night, and I came to find you." understanding, and then a fresh wave of fear moved across her face as the pieces began falling into place. Blackthorn, she repeated faintly. I am in enemy territory. Kane shook his head firmly. You are not a prisoner here, Elena. You are a guest, and you will remain one for as long as you need, until you are strong enough to decide what you want to do next. No one in this pack will touch you without your permission. No one will force you to do anything against your will. She studied him carefully, searching his face for the deception she had learned, through painful experience, to expect from those with power over her. What she found instead was a steadiness that unsettled her more than any threat could have, a calm sincerity that did not match anything she had known in years. Why? She asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Why would you do any of this for someone you do not even know? Kane considered the question for a long moment before answering honestly. I am not entirely sure myself, he admitted, but I read your message, and I could not ignore it. Something told me it mattered, that you mattered, and I have learned to trust instincts like that, even when I cannot fully explain them. Elena's eyes filled with unexpected tears, and she looked away quickly, embarrassed by the sudden rush of emotion she had not permitted herself to feel in longer than she could remember. No one had asked about her well-being in longer than she could remember. No one had looked at her with anything resembling genuine concern. The unfamiliarity of it was almost harder to bear than the pain in her ribs. I do not know how to accept kindness anymore, she admitted quietly, the confession slipping out before she could stop it. I am not sure I remember how. Kane's chest tightened at the raw honesty of her words, and he resisted the urge to reach for her hand, sensing that she needed space more than comfort right now. Then we will figure it out together, he said instead. There is no rush. You have time now, more time than you have probably had in a long while, and no one here expects anything from you except to heal. Elena studied him for a long moment, something shifting behind her tired eyes, a fragile and cautious flicker of something that might, with enough time, grow into trust. She did not know this man, did not know why fate had chosen to place her recovery in the hands of a stranger from a rival pack, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something other than fear settling over her chest. It felt, strange as it seemed, almost like safety. Over the following days, Elena remained in Kane's private quarters, tended carefully by Priya, and watched over constantly by Kane himself, who rearranged his schedule to spend as much time near her as his responsibilities allowed. He learned quickly that she startled easily at sudden movements, that she flinched instinctively whenever someone raised their voice even slightly, that she often ate very little, as though she had trained herself to expect scarcity, even when a full meal sat before her. Each observation added another layer to the picture forming in his mind, a picture of a woman who had spent years shrinking herself to survive. He never pushed her to talk about what had happened. He simply remained present, steady and patient, offering small kindnesses without expectation of anything in return. He brought her books from the pack library when she mentioned, almost shyly, that she used to love reading, before she stopped having the energy for it. He arranged for warm meals to be brought to her, at whatever hours she felt hungry, rather than forcing her onto a rigid schedule. He asked her opinion on small decisions, what color she preferred for new bedding, whether she wanted the window open or closed, small questions that carried an enormous unspoken message. Her preferences mattered here. Her voice carried weight. Her existence was not an inconvenience to be managed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, something in Elena began to soften. She spoke a little more each day, offered small observations about the pack she was beginning to understand, occasionally allowed herself a hesitant smile. When Kane said something that struck her as genuinely funny, she still flinched at unexpected sounds. She still watched exits carefully whenever she entered an unfamiliar room. But the fear that had gripped her so completely on that first night began, gradually, to loosen its hold. Garrett watched the changes with quiet interest, noting how differently Kane carried himself these days, lighter somehow, despite the seriousness of the situation unfolding around them. He said nothing about it directly, understanding that whatever was growing between his alpha and this woman from Ravenswood needed room to develop naturally, without outside pressure or commentary. But even as Elena began to heal within the safety of Blackthorn's walls, a quieter concern gnawed at the back of Kane's mind. Ravenswood territory was not so far away, and Damon Ashford was not a man likely to remain silent about the disappearance of his mate, regardless of how little he had valued her, while she remained under his protection. Kane knew, with the same certainty that had driven him out into that storm days earlier, that the peace surrounding Elena's recovery would not last forever. Somewhere across the border, he suspected, questions were already being asked, and answers, however unwelcome, would eventually need to be given. 10 days had passed since Kane carried Elena across the border into Blackthorn territory, and in that time, word of her presence had begun to spread quietly through the pack, carried in whispered conversations among warriors and healers alike. Most who encountered her treated her with careful respect, sensing without being told that their alpha considered her protection a matter of great personal importance. A few, however, viewed her arrival with suspicion, wary of what it might mean for relations with Ravenswood, a pack with which Blackthorn had maintained a fragile but functional peace for nearly a decade. Elena felt the weight of these mixed reactions keenly, even as she slowly regained her strength. She had grown skilled, over the years, at reading the subtle signs of unwelcome, and though most of Blackthorn's members seemed genuinely kind, she remained acutely aware that her presence complicated things for Kane, in ways she had not fully considered when she sent that desperate message into the void. She raised the subject one evening as they sat together in the small garden behind Kane's quarters, a quiet space he had shown her only a few days earlier, filled with herbs Priya used for healing and a handful of late-blooming flowers that had survived the season's first frost. Elena had come to treasure these evening conversations, the only time of day when the constant low hum of anxiety in her chest seemed to quiet enough for her to breathe freely. "I am causing you trouble, are I not?" she said quietly, watching a moth circle the small lantern Kane had lit against the gathering dusk. "Some of your pack members do not want me here." Kane considered his answer carefully before speaking, unwilling to dismiss her concern but equally unwilling to let it take root without correction. "Some are cautious," he admitted. "That is natural, given the history between our territories. But cautious is not the same as unwelcoming, and I promise you, no one in this pack would dare treat you with anything less than respect, while you remain under my protection." "And if Damon comes looking for me," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, the question clearly one she had been turning over in her mind for days, without finding the courage to voice aloud, "what happens then?" Kane's expression hardened slightly at the mention of the name, though he kept his voice gentle for her sake. "Then he will find that I have no intention of returning you to a situation that nearly cost you your life," he said firmly. "Whatever claim he believes he holds over you, Elena, it means nothing if it comes at the price of your safety. I will not allow it." Elena studied him in the flickering lantern light, searching his face for any hint of the possessiveness she had grown so accustomed to fearing, the kind of protection that came with hidden conditions and quiet cruelty disguised as concern. She found none of it. What she saw instead was a steady, unwavering resolve that had nothing to do with control and everything to do with genuine care, a distinction she was only beginning to understand existed. "I do not know how to thank you for any of this," she said finally. "You have given me more kindness in 10 days than I received in years of my own pack. I do not understand why." Kane was quiet for a long moment, weighing how much to share with her, aware that the truth of what he felt might overwhelm someone still healing from so much pain. In the end, he chose honesty, believing she deserved nothing less after everything she had endured. "Elena," he said carefully, "there is something I have not fully explained to you, something that happened the moment I found you on that road. I do not know if you are familiar with the old stories, the ones about fated bonds between mates, the kind most modern wolves consider more legend than reality." Elena's brow furrowed slightly, uncertain where this conversation was heading, though a strange flutter of anticipation stirred in her chest. "I have heard of them," she said cautiously. "My grandmother used to speak of such things, though I always assumed they were exaggerated." "I believed the same," Kane admitted, "until I touched your hand that night and felt something I have no adequate words to describe. A recognition, a certainty that went beyond anything logical. My wolf knew you immediately, Elena, in a way I have never experienced before, and did not believe I ever would." Elena's breath caught, and she looked away, overwhelmed by the implications of what he was telling her. "Are you saying—" she started, then stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "I am saying you are my mate," Kane said quietly, the words carrying a weight and sincerity that left no room for doubt. I understand this may be difficult to hear, especially now, given everything you have survived and everything you are still recovering from. I am not asking anything of you, Elena. I only wanted you to understand why I feel so strongly compelled to protect you. Why walking away from you was never something I considered possible, not even for a moment. Tears gathered in Elena's eyes, though she could not entirely identify the emotion driving them, some tangled mixture of fear, disbelief, and a fragile hope she barely dared to acknowledge. I do not know how to be anyone's mate, she admitted quietly. I spent years believing I was fortunate simply to be tolerated. I do not know how to accept being wanted, truly wanted, without conditions attached. Kane reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and gently took her hand in his own. Then we will learn together, he said softly. There is no timeline for this, Elena. No pressure, no expectation beyond your own comfort and healing. I only wanted you to know the truth, so that whatever choices you make going forward, you make them with complete information and complete freedom. Elena did not pull her hand away. She sat quietly beside him in the fading light, feeling the warmth of his palm against hers, allowing herself, for just a moment, to imagine a future built on something other than fear and survival. It was a fragile thing, this budding sense of possibility, but it was there, undeniable and quietly persistent, growing stronger with each passing day she spent within the safety of Blackthorn's walls. That fragile peace, however, was not destined to last uninterrupted. 3 days later, a Blackthorn patrol returning from the eastern border brought urgent news to the main hall. A delegation from Ravenswood territory had been spotted approaching, moving with the formal bearing of an official envoy rather than a scouting party. Their numbers small, but their intent unmistakable. Kane received the report while reviewing territorial documents with Garrett, and the moment the words left the messenger's mouth, he felt the fragile calm of the past 10 days begin to fracture. They are asking for an audience, the messenger reported. They claim to be searching for a missing pack member and believe she may have crossed into our territory. Garrett's eyes flicked immediately to Kane, gauging his reaction with the careful attention of a man who had spent years learning to read his alpha's moods. How many in the delegation? He asked the messenger. 4, the man replied, led by Colin, one of Ashford's senior advisors. Ashford himself is not among them. Kane exhaled slowly, forcing himself to think clearly despite the surge of protective anger rising in his chest. Ashford sending an advisor rather than coming, personally suggested either caution or arrogance, and Kane suspected, given what he had learned of the man's character, it was likely the latter. He turned to Garrett, his expression settling into the calm, calculated focus that had earned him respect among allies and rivals alike, even as fury simmered beneath the surface. Bring them to the main hall, he instructed the messenger, formally, with appropriate courtesy. I will meet with them myself. Once the messenger departed, Garrett turned to Kane with obvious concern. You cannot mention Elena's location, he said carefully. Not until we understand what they intend to do with that information. I have no intention of revealing anything without her knowledge and consent, Kane replied firmly. But I will not lie outright either. Not in a way that could later be used to accuse me of deception before the wider Pack Council. We will have to walk this carefully. He found Elena in the garden a short while later, her expression immediately shifting to alarm the moment she registered the tension in his posture. Something is wrong, she said, rising quickly from the bench where she had been sitting. A delegation from Ravenswood has arrived, Kane told her gently, unwilling to soften the truth in a way that might later feel like betrayal. They are asking about you. Elena's face drained of color, her hands beginning to tremble almost immediately. They know I am here. They suspect it, Kane corrected carefully. I have not confirmed anything yet. Elena, I need you to understand something clearly. No one will force you to see them, to speak with them, or to return with them, regardless of what claims they make. You have a choice here, a real choice, and I will honor whatever you decide. Elena wrapped her arms around herself, an old defensive habit Kane had noticed many times over the past 10 days, one she seemed to fall into whenever fear threatened to overwhelm her. What if they demand my return? She asked quietly. What if Pack law requires it? Pack law recognizes the right of any individual to seek protection from harm, regardless of prior mate bonds or territorial claims, Kane said firmly. I have already begun documenting your injuries, with Priya's professional assessment, in case this situation escalates to a formal council review. You are not without protection here, Elena. Whatever happens next, you will not face it alone. Something in his steady certainty seemed to anchor her, and she drew a slow, deliberate breath, visibly working to calm the panic rising within her. I want to know what they say, she said finally, her voice gaining a thread of resolve that Kane had not heard from her before. I do not want to hide from this. I have spent too many years hiding from things that terrified me. I would like to listen, even if I am not ready to face them directly yet. Kane nodded, respecting the small but significant step she was taking. Then you will listen from the adjoining chamber, he said, close enough to hear everything, but not required to be seen unless you choose otherwise. Elena agreed, and together they made their way toward the main hall, where the fate of the fragile peace they had built over the past 10 days now hung uncertainly in the balance, waiting to be decided by words not yet spoken and choices not yet made. The main hall of Blackthorn territory was an imposing space, built from dark stone and high wooden beams, designed centuries earlier to convey strength and permanence to anyone who entered it. Kane took his seat at the head of the long table, Garrett stationed at his right hand, as the Ravenswood delegation was ushered inside under careful watch from Blackthorn guards positioned discreetly along the walls. Colin, the senior advisor leading the delegation, was a tall man with sharp, calculating eyes and the kind of practiced smile that suggested years of diplomatic training rather than genuine warmth. He inclined his head respectfully as he approached the table, though Kane noted the slight edge of challenge beneath the courteous gesture. Alpha Whitlock, Colin began smoothly, thank you for granting us this audience on short notice. We come on behalf of Alpha Ashford, regarding a matter of some urgency. Kane kept his expression carefully neutral, folding his hands on the table before him. I am listening. A member of our pack has gone missing under troubling circumstances, Colin continued. Elena Voss, mate to Alpha Ashford himself. We have reason to believe she may have wandered into your territory, following an incident of confusion several nights ago, possibly disoriented from an illness that has affected her judgment in recent weeks. Kane's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly at the blatant fabrication. The casual way Colin dressed up abandonment and cruelty as some vague medical episode designed to explain away Elena's injuries and absence alike. Behind him, hidden from view in the adjoining chamber, Elena listened with her hands pressed tightly over her mouth, fury and disbelief warring within her at the audacity of the lie being spun on her behalf. An illness, Kane repeated evenly, his tone carefully controlled, despite the anger simmering beneath his composed exterior. That is an interesting characterization of events, Colin. Perhaps you might clarify what specific illness would leave a person with the extensive physical injuries currently being treated by our pack healer. Colin's confident expression flickered, just slightly, before he recovered his composure. We are, of course, deeply concerned for her well-being, he said carefully. If she is indeed within your territory, Alpha Ashford would be greatly relieved to know she is safe, and would request her immediate return so that she might receive proper care among her own pack. Kane leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping into a register that carried unmistakable authority despite its quiet volume. Let me be entirely clear, he said. If the woman you are describing is indeed within Blackthorn territory, she will remain here for as long as she wishes to remain, under whatever protection she requires. I have documented evidence, gathered by a qualified healer, indicating a pattern of injury, inconsistent with any illness, and entirely consistent with sustained mistreatment. Should Alpha Ashford wish to pursue this matter further, I would welcome the opportunity to present that evidence before a formal pack council. The color drained slightly from Colin's face, the polished diplomacy cracking just enough to reveal genuine alarm beneath it. That is a serious accusation, Alpha Whitlock, he said carefully. It is a serious injury, Kane replied without hesitation, and I intend to see it addressed seriously, through proper channels, with full transparency. You may relay that message to Alpha Ashford directly, along with my expectation that he refrain from any further attempts to reclaim her, without her own explicit and freely given consent. Colin studied Kane for a long, tense moment, clearly recalculating his approach in the face of unexpected resistance. Finally, he inclined his head stiffly. I will relay your position, Alpha Whitlock, he said, though his tone carried a coldness that had not been present at the start of the meeting. I suspect this will not be the last conversation our packs have regarding this matter. I suspect you are right, Kane replied evenly, rising from his seat as a clear signal that the audience had ended. But rest assured, whatever conversations follow, they will center on the truth of what happened to her, not the version your alpha would prefer to tell. The delegation departed shortly after, their formal courtesy barely masking the tension that had settled over the room, and Kane remained standing at the head of the table for a long moment after they left, his hands braced against the wood, as he worked to steady the anger still coursing through him. In the adjoining chamber, Elena emerged slowly, her face pale, but her expression carrying something new, something that had not been there before. A spark of quiet determination, kindled by hearing, for the first time, someone else refused to accept the lies that had been told about her for so long. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly with emotion she had not yet fully processed, "for not letting them rewrite what happened to me." Kane turned to her, his expression softening immediately despite the residual tension in his shoulders. "I will never let anyone rewrite your story, Elena," he said quietly, "not while I have breath in my body to stop it." Outside the great hall, storm clouds had begun gathering once more over the horizon, dark and heavy, a fitting reflection of the conflict now brewing between the two territories. Kane knew, with the same certainty that had guided him through the rain to find her days earlier, that Damon Ashford would not accept this outcome quietly. Whatever peace they had found in the past 10 days was only the calm before a much larger storm, one that would test everything Elena had begun to rebuild and everything Kane had sworn to protect. News of the Ravenswood delegation's visit spread quickly through Blackthorn territory in the days that followed, and with it came a subtle but noticeable shift in how the pack regarded Elena. Where before there had been cautious politeness, mixed with occasional suspicion, now there was something closer to quiet solidarity. Word of Colin's fabricated story about illness and confusion had circulated among the senior members present in the hall, and the blatant dishonesty of it had done more to earn Elena's sympathy than any explanation Kane could have offered on her behalf. She noticed the change almost immediately, small kindnesses that had nothing to do with her connection to Kane, and everything to do with genuine concern for her well-being. One of the younger pack members, a woman named Mira who worked closely with Priya in the healing quarters, began seeking her out during the quiet afternoon hours, bringing tea and simple conversation that asked nothing of Elena beyond her presence. "You do not have to talk if you do not want to," Mira told her during one such visit, settling into the chair beside Elena's bed with the easy comfort of someone accustomed to sitting with people who were still learning how to trust again. "I just thought you might like company that does not come with questions attached." Elena found herself grateful for the gesture, in a way she struggled to articulate. So much of her recovery had involved careful, deliberate conversations about her feelings, her fears, her slow rebuilding of trust, and while she understood the necessity of those conversations, there was something deeply restful about simply existing beside another person, without the weight of explanation. "I appreciate that," Elena said quietly, wrapping her hands around the warm cup Mira had brought her. "More than you probably realize." Mira smiled, a genuine, easy expression that reminded Elena of friendships she had once had before Damon's influence had slowly isolated her from anyone who might have noticed how badly she was struggling. "I have heard some of what happened to you," Mira said gently. "I will not pretend I know exactly what you have been through, but I want you to know that everyone here respects how strong you have been, even when it probably did not feel like strength at the time." Elena's throat tightened at the unexpected kindness, and she looked down at her cup, unable to meet Mira's eyes for a moment. "It did not feel like strength," she admitted quietly. "Most days it just felt like survival, like getting through one more hour without falling apart completely." "Sometimes that is exactly what strength looks like," Mira said simply. "It does not always have to be dramatic to count." The conversation lingered in Elena's mind, long after Mira left, a small but significant shift in how she understood her own experience. For years she had internalized Damon's narrative that her struggles were weaknesses, personal failures that justified his frustration and eventual cruelty. Hearing someone else frame her survival as strength rather than failure planted a seed of reconsideration that would continue growing throughout the following weeks. Kane, meanwhile, found himself increasingly occupied by the practical fallout of the Ravenswood delegation's visit. Reports filtered in from scouts along the border indicating increased patrol activity from Ravenswood territory, a clear sign that Damon Ashford had not taken kindly to Kane's refusal to return Elena. Garrett spent long hours with Kane, reviewing defensive strategies, aware that whatever came next would likely test the strength of Blackthorn's borders as much as the strength of its alpha's resolve. "We cannot ignore the possibility of direct confrontation," Garrett said during one such planning session, spreading a territorial map across the table between them. "Ashford is not the type to simply accept a loss of this magnitude quietly. His pride alone will demand some form of response." Kane studied the map, tracing the border between their territories with a careful finger. "What response?" he mused aloud. "Formal challenge through the Pack Council seems unlikely, given the evidence I threatened to present. Direct incursion would be an act of war neither of our packs can afford, not with tensions already fragile across the wider region." "Then perhaps something quieter," Garrett suggested. "Political pressure. Rumors designed to damage your standing among the other territories. Ashford strikes me as a man who prefers manipulation to open confrontation." Kane's expression darkened slightly at the thought. "That would be the more dangerous path, honestly," he admitted. "Direct conflict I can prepare for. Whispers and manufactured scandal are much harder to fight." Their concerns proved well-founded within the week. Reports began reaching Blackthorn of rumors circulating among neighboring territories, subtle distortions of the truth suggesting that Kane had orchestrated an unprovoked incursion into Ravenswood land, kidnapping a vulnerable pack member under the pretense of rescue, while actually pursuing personal ambitions of territorial expansion. The rumors were carefully crafted, containing just enough plausible detail to sow doubt among those who did not know Kane personally, while omitting entirely the extensive evidence of Elena's mistreatment. Kane received word of the rumors from an ally in a neighboring territory, a fellow alpha named Owen who had maintained friendly relations with Blackthorn for many years, and felt obligated to warn Kane of the narrative spreading beyond their immediate borders. "People are starting to ask questions," Owen told him during a private call, his tone carrying genuine concern. "Ashford is playing this carefully, framing himself as the wronged party. If this continues unchecked, you may find yourself facing formal scrutiny from the wider Pack Council, regardless of the actual circumstances." Kane thanked Owen for the warning, ending the call with a growing sense of urgency he had not felt since the night he first found Elena on that rain-soaked road. The situation had evolved from a personal matter of protection into something with far broader political implications, and he knew that navigating it successfully would require more than good intentions alone. He brought the concern to Elena that evening, unwilling to keep her uninformed about developments that would ultimately affect her own safety and future. She listened carefully as he explained the rumors circulating through neighboring territories, her expression growing increasingly troubled as she recognized the potential consequences of Damon's campaign. "This is my fault," she said quietly once Kane finished explaining. "If I had never sent that message, none of this would be happening. You would not be facing accusations. Your pack would not be under this kind of pressure." Kane moved to sit beside her, taking her hand gently in his own, unwilling to let that particular narrative take root in her mind. "This is not your fault, Elena," he said firmly. "You survived a situation that should never have existed in the first place. The fact that Ashford is now attempting to manipulate the truth in order to protect his own reputation speaks entirely to his character, not to any failing on your part. But you are facing real consequences," she pressed, her voice tightening with distress. "Your standing among other packs, the trust you have built over years of leadership, all of it is being threatened because of choices you made to protect me. I would make those same choices again without hesitation," Kane said, his voice carrying unmistakable conviction. "Elena, listen to me carefully. I do not regret a single decision I made that night, nor any decision I have made since. If protecting you comes with political complications, then I will navigate those complications with the same determination I bring to every challenge my pack faces. You are not a burden I am tolerating. You matter to me, deeply, and that has nothing to do with the rumors circulating outside these walls." Elena studied him carefully, searching for any hint of resentment beneath his words, any indication that his patience might one day wear thin, the way Damon's once had. She found none. What she found instead was a steadiness that had remained constant throughout every difficult conversation they had shared, a consistency that stood in stark contrast to the unpredictable cruelty she had endured for years. "I want to help," she said finally, straightening slightly as a new resolve settled over her features. "If Ashford is spreading lies about what happened, then I want to tell the truth myself, formally, in whatever setting would carry the most weight. I am tired of being spoken about as though I have no voice of my own." Kane's expression shifted with quiet pride at the determination in her words, a marked change from the fearful, uncertain woman he had carried across the border weeks earlier. "Are you certain?" he asked carefully. Testifying formally, whether before the Pack Council or in some other official capacity, would mean confronting everything that happened to you directly, in front of others. That is not a small thing to ask of yourself. "I know," Elena said, though her voice trembled slightly with the admission. "But I have spent years letting other people control my story, deciding what version of events was convenient for them. I do not want to do that anymore. If speaking up means Ashford's lies cannot stand unchallenged, then I want to speak up, even if it terrifies me." Kane squeezed her hand gently, admiration evident in his expression. "Then we will prepare for it together," he said. "Whatever you need, whatever support helps you feel ready, I will make certain you have it." Over the following days, Elena began working closely with Priya to formally document her injuries and their likely causes, creating a detailed record that could withstand scrutiny before any council review. She also began speaking, carefully and gradually, with a counselor Kane arranged for her, a woman named Sophia who specialized in helping survivors of mistreatment process their experiences and find language for testimony that honored both truth and their own emotional well-being. The process was not easy. Elena found herself confronting memories she had spent years trying to suppress, moments of cruelty and neglect that she had convinced herself were somehow deserved, consequences of her own inadequacy, rather than deliberate mistreatment by someone who should have protected her. Sophia's gentle guidance helped her begin separating those tangled beliefs, slowly rebuilding a clearer understanding of what had actually happened to her, free from the distorted narrative Damon had spent years constructing. Kane remained a steady presence throughout this difficult process, never pushing for details she was not ready to share, never expressing impatience with the slow pace of her healing. He simply remained available, offering quiet support whenever she needed it, and gradually, Elena found herself growing not only stronger in body, but steadier in spirit, rebuilding piece by piece the sense of self that years of mistreatment had nearly erased entirely. Meanwhile, tensions along the border between Blackthorn and Ravenswood continued to simmer, each day bringing new reports of increased patrol activity, cautious probing that stopped just short of open confrontation. Garrett kept Kane informed of every development, and together, they continued preparing defensive strategies, while also working through official channels to request a formal Pack Council review of the growing dispute. The council, composed of alphas from territories across the wider region, agreed to convene within the month, giving both sides time to prepare their case. Kane knew this timeline would prove critical, offering Elena the opportunity to continue healing and preparing her testimony, while simultaneously providing Damon Ashford ample time to construct whatever elaborate defense he intended to present. As the weeks passed, Elena's transformation became increasingly evident to everyone around her. The frightened, broken woman Kane had carried across the border had begun, slowly but unmistakably, to reclaim pieces of herself long buried beneath years of fear and suppression. She still had difficult days, moments when old anxieties resurfaced without warning, but she also had moments of genuine laughter, quiet confidence, and a growing sense of purpose that had been entirely absent from her life for far too long. Kane watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and deepening affection that continued to surprise him with its intensity. What had begun as an instinctive, almost involuntary pull toward a stranger in need had evolved, over the weeks of careful patience and mutual respect, into something he could no longer deny was genuine and profound love, rooted not in the mysterious pull of fate alone, but in the person Elena was proving herself to be with every passing day. He said nothing of this deepening feeling to her directly, understanding that she needed space to focus on her healing and her upcoming testimony without the additional weight of romantic expectation. But he found himself looking forward to their quiet evenings in the garden more each day, treasuring the gradual unfolding of her personality, her sharp wit that emerged more frequently as she grew comfortable, her fierce intelligence that had clearly been suppressed for years by a partner threatened by her potential. The formal council review, scheduled to take place within Blackthorn territory as neutral ground acceptable to both parties, loomed on the horizon like a decisive turning point neither Kane nor Elena could avoid. Whatever the outcome, both of them understood that the coming confrontation would determine far more than the resolution of a single territorial dispute. It would determine whether Elena's truth would finally be heard, and whether the fragile new life she had begun building within Blackthorn's walls could stand firm against the weight of Damon Ashford's carefully constructed lies. 3 weeks had passed since the Ravenswood delegation's visit, and Elena had grown noticeably stronger, both physically and emotionally, though the approaching council review cast a persistent shadow over her progress. She spent her mornings working with Priya, continuing to build the medical documentation that would form the backbone of her testimony, and her afternoons with Sophia, slowly untangling years of distorted thinking that Damon's mistreatment had woven into her understanding of herself. It was during one of these afternoon sessions that Elena finally spoke, for the first time in full detail, about how her relationship with Damon had begun, and how gradually, almost imperceptibly, it had transformed into something that trapped her so completely she had nearly stopped believing escape was possible. "We were paired together when I was very young," she explained to Sophia, her voice steady despite the vulnerability of the memory. "Our parents arranged the introduction, hoping it might lead somewhere. At first, he seemed attentive, even charming in his own way. I mistook his intensity for devotion. I did not understand yet that intensity and control often wear the same disguise." Sophia listened without interrupting, allowing Elena the space to work through the memory at her own pace. "When did things begin to change?" she asked gently once Elena paused. "Slowly," Elena said. "So slowly I barely noticed at first. Small comments about my choices, my friendships, my ambitions. He would frame his criticism as concern, as though he only wanted what was best for me. But somehow his concern always resulted in me having less freedom, fewer friends, fewer opportunities to exist outside his influence." She paused, twisting her hands together in her lap, an old nervous habit that had lessened considerably in recent weeks but still emerged during particularly difficult conversations. "By the time I recognized the pattern for what it was," she continued quietly, "I had already lost most of the connections that might have helped me see clearly. My sister moved away for work. My closest friends drifted apart, partly because Damon discouraged those friendships in ways that seemed reasonable at the time but were, I understand now, deliberate isolation." Sophia nodded, her expression carrying gentle understanding rather than judgment. "That is an incredibly common pattern," she said. "Isolation is often one of the earliest tools used to establish control, precisely because it happens gradually enough that the person experiencing it rarely recognizes the danger until they are already deeply entangled." Elena absorbed this information slowly, feeling something settle into place within her, a clarity that had been building for weeks but crystallized fully in this moment. "I kept thinking there was something wrong with me," she admitted. "That if I could just be better somehow, more patient, more understanding, less demanding of his time and attention, things would improve. I spent years trying to shrink myself into whatever shape might finally make him satisfied." "And did it work?" Sophia asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Elena shook her head slowly. "It never worked. There was always something new to criticize, some new failing to point to. I understand now that nothing I could have done would have satisfied him, because the goal was never actually my improvement. The goal was maintaining control, and control requires an endless supply of inadequacy to justify itself." The session continued for another hour, Elena working through additional memories with a clarity and courage that surprised even herself. By the time she left Sophia's office that afternoon, she felt exhausted, but also lighter, as though each difficult memory she confronted directly lost some portion of its power over her. She found Kane waiting for her near the garden entrance, as he often did after her sessions, though he never pressed her for details about what had been discussed. Today, however, Elena found herself wanting to share, at least partially, the progress she had made. "I think I finally understand what happened to me," she told him, as they walked slowly through the garden together, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the carefully tended paths. Not just what he did, but why it worked for so long. Why I could not see it clearly while I was living inside it. Kane listened attentively, matching his pace to hers, careful not to rush the conversation. "That sounds like important progress," he said gently. "It is strange," Elena continued, choosing her words carefully. "For years I believed his version of events so completely that I could not imagine any other explanation. I thought I was simply failing at being a good mate, a good partner. It never occurred to me that the entire framework he built was designed specifically to make me believe that." She paused near a small stone bench, settling onto it with a thoughtful expression. "I keep thinking about how differently you have treated me since the moment you found me," she said. "You have never once made me feel like a burden or an inconvenience, even though my presence here has caused real complications for you and your pack. I do not know how to reconcile that with everything I believed for so long about my own worth." Kane sat beside her, close enough to offer comfort, but careful to maintain the respectful distance she still sometimes needed. "Because your worth was never actually in question, Elena," he said firmly. "What was in question was Damon's capacity for genuine care, and the answer to that question, unfortunately, turned out to be very little. That failure belongs entirely to him. It says nothing about you." Elena turned to look at him, something vulnerable and searching in her expression. "How do you know so certainly?" she asked quietly. "How can you be so sure I am not simply difficult, or demanding, or whatever else he always claimed?" "Because I have spent weeks watching you," Kane said simply. "I have seen how carefully you consider other people's feelings, how quickly you thank even the smallest kindness, how hard you work to understand your own patterns so you can heal from them rather than simply blaming everyone else. Those are not the qualities of someone who is difficult or demanding, Elena. Those are the qualities of someone who has spent far too long undervaluing herself while overextending grace to someone who never deserved it." Elena's eyes filled with tears at his words, and this time she did not look away or try to hide the emotion. Something about hearing her own worth articulated so clearly, so confidently, by someone whose opinion she had come to value deeply, broke through a barrier she had maintained for years, without fully realizing it. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "for seeing me clearly, even when I could not see myself that way." Kane reached over slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and gently brushed a tear from her cheek. "I will always see you clearly, Elena," he said softly. "That is not something that requires effort on my part. It is simply the truth of who you are." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while after that, the weight of the conversation settling into something peaceful rather than heavy. Elena found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, allowing herself to imagine a future that felt genuinely hopeful rather than merely survivable. That evening, however, brought news that shattered the peaceful atmosphere of the afternoon. Garrett arrived at Kane's quarters with an expression of grave concern, a tablet in his hand displaying updated reports from the border patrols. "Ashford has requested an early hearing before the Pack Council," Garrett reported, his tone carrying barely restrained frustration. "He is claiming urgent grounds, insisting that further delay risks permanent damage to Ravenswood's territorial standing. The Council has agreed to move the hearing forward. It will take place in 5 days." Kane's expression darkened immediately, understanding at once what this acceleration likely meant. "He wants to catch us unprepared," Kane said grimly. 5 days is not enough time to properly finalize Elena's testimony, or ensure she feels ready to face this. Elena, who had accompanied Kane to receive the news, felt a fresh wave of anxiety wash over her at the announcement, though she forced herself to breathe through it, rather than allowing panic to take control the way it once might have. "I can be ready," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "Whatever timeline they set, I will find a way to be ready." Kane turned to her, concern evident in his expression. "Elena, you do not have to rush this. If necessary, I can request a formal extension, based on the medical complexity of the documentation involved." Elena shook her head firmly. "No," she said. "If Ashford wants to move quickly, then perhaps that works in my favor as much as his. He has had weeks to construct his lies. I do not need weeks to tell the truth. I only need the courage to say it clearly, and I believe, after everything these past weeks have taught me, that I finally have that courage." Garrett watched this exchange with quiet admiration, recognizing in Elena's resolve the same fierce determination he had come to respect deeply in Kane over their years of friendship. It seemed increasingly clear to him that whatever bond had drawn these two together on that rainy roadside was proving itself, day by day, to be built on far more than instinct alone. The following 5 days passed in a blur of careful preparation. Sophia worked closely with Elena to organize her testimony into a clear, coherent account that would withstand scrutiny while honoring the full truth of her experience. Priya finalized her medical documentation, ensuring every injury was properly recorded with appropriate context. Kane, meanwhile, coordinated with Garrett and his advisors to prepare Blackthorn's formal position, gathering additional evidence and identifying witnesses who could speak to Elena's condition upon her arrival weeks earlier. Despite the mounting pressure, Elena found herself growing steadier with each passing day, rather than more anxious. Something about actively participating in her own defense, rather than passively enduring whatever narrative others constructed around her, gave her a sense of agency she had been denied for far too long. By the time the 5th day arrived, she felt as prepared as she believed she could ever be, standing at the threshold of a confrontation that would determine not only the outcome of a territorial dispute, but the direction of the rest of her life. Kane found her early that morning, standing quietly in the garden where so much of her healing had taken place, watching the sunrise paint the sky in soft shades of gold and pink. He approached slowly, careful not to startle her from whatever thoughts occupied her mind. "Are you ready?" he asked gently, coming to stand beside her. Elena was quiet for a long moment, watching the light spread slowly across the horizon. "I do not know if ready is the right word," she admitted finally, "but I know I am no longer afraid to try, and after everything, I think that matters more than certainty ever could." Kane reached for her hand, and this time, she took it without hesitation, her fingers curling around his with a firmness that spoke to how far she had come since the frightened, broken woman he had carried across the border weeks earlier. "Whatever happens today," he said quietly, "you have already proven something remarkable, Elena. You have taken back your own voice. No council decision can undo that." Together, they turned from the garden and made their way toward the great hall, where the formal council hearing awaited, carrying with it the weight of Elena's entire future, and the possibility, however fragile, of finally closing the door on the pain that had defined so much of her past. The great hall of Blackthorn territory had been transformed for the occasion. Long tables arranged in a wide circle to accommodate the visiting alphas and their advisors who had traveled from territories across the region to sit on the formal pack council. Kane recognized most of the faces present, leaders he had known for years through various territorial agreements and gatherings, though the gravity of the current proceedings lent an unfamiliar tension to what would normally have been cordial greetings. Owen, the alpha who had first warned Kane about the rumors circulating through neighboring territories, offered a small, supportive nod as Kane and Elena entered the hall together. Several other council members regarded Elena with open curiosity, having heard only fragments of the story that had prompted this unusual hearing, while others watched with the careful neutrality of those determined to withhold judgment until all evidence had been presented. Damon Ashford arrived shortly after, flanked by Colin and 2 additional advisors, his expression composed into a mask of wounded dignity that Kane recognized immediately as calculated performance. He wore his authority like a well-tailored coat, every gesture and expression carefully designed to project the image of a reasonable leader, wronged by unfounded accusations. Elena's grip on Kane's hand tightened noticeably the moment Damon entered the room, old fear flickering across her features despite the weeks of preparation and healing that had brought her to this point. Kane leaned close, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You do not have to look at him," he murmured. "Focus on the council. Focus on your own truth. He no longer has any power here that you do not choose to give him." Elena drew a slow, steadying breath, and Kane watched with quiet pride as something in her posture shifted, her shoulders straightening, her chin lifting slightly, the physical manifestation of a resolve that had been building within her for weeks. She released a small nod, and together, they took their designated seats as the presiding council member, an elderly alpha named Marcus, who had earned widespread respect for his fairness over decades of leadership, called the hearing to order. "We are gathered today to address a dispute between Blackthorn and Ravenswood territories," Marcus began, his voice carrying easily through the quiet hall. "Specifically, the circumstances surrounding the presence of Elena Voss within Blackthorn territory, and the competing claims regarding her well-being and her rightful place." Both parties will be given full opportunity to present evidence and testimony. This council will then deliberate and render a decision consistent with established PAC law and the well-being of all involved. Damon was invited to speak first, and he rose with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to commanding attention, his voice carrying warm, measured concern that Kane recognized as carefully rehearsed performance rather than genuine emotion. "Esteemed council," Damon began, "I stand before you today deeply troubled by recent events. Elena, my maid of many years, disappeared from our territory under circumstances that remain unclear to me even now. I have since learned that Alpha Whitlock personally led an armed incursion into Ravenswood land, removing her without proper notification or consent from myself or our PAC elders. Whatever concerns may exist regarding her well-being, and I acknowledge that our relationship has faced difficulties in recent months, the manner in which this situation unfolded represents a clear violation of territorial protocol." He continued for several more minutes, weaving a careful narrative that acknowledged just enough imperfection in their relationship to seem credible, while thoroughly obscuring the extent of Elena's suffering, framing Kane's rescue as reckless overreach rather than necessary intervention. Several council members exchanged uncertain glances as he spoke, clearly weighing the plausibility of his measured, reasonable presentation. When Damon finally concluded, Marcus turned his attention to Kane. "Alpha Whitlock, you may present your response." Kane rose slowly, his presence commanding the room without need for exaggerated gesture or performance. "Esteemed council," he began, his voice steady and clear, "I do not dispute that I entered Ravenswood territory without prior notification. I made that choice deliberately, and I would make it again without hesitation, because the alternative was allowing a woman to die alone on a roadside while I waited for diplomatic permission that might never have arrived in time." A murmur passed through the assembled council members at the directness of his statement. Kane continued without pause, describing in careful detail the message Elena had sent him, the search that followed, and the condition in which his team had found her. He spoke of Priya's medical assessment, the pattern of injuries both fresh and old that told a story no illness could explain. As he spoke, he gestured to a formal document prepared by Priya, offering it to the council for their review. "This is not a matter of territorial protocol," Kane said firmly, once the document had been passed among the council members. "This is a matter of a woman's survival, and of the truth that has been deliberately obscured by fabricated explanations designed to avoid accountability. I would ask the council's permission to allow Elena to speak for herself, so that her own voice, so long silenced, might finally be heard in full." Marcus considered the request for a long moment before nodding gravely. "The council grants permission," he said. "Elena Voss, if you are willing, you may address this council directly." Elena rose slowly, aware of every eye in the room turning toward her, aware most acutely of Damon's gaze fixed upon her with an intensity that once would have reduced her to silence. She found, however, that the fear she expected did not overwhelm her as thoroughly as she had feared. Instead, she felt something steadier beneath it, a quiet resolve that had been growing within her for weeks, finally ready to be spoken aloud. "Esteemed council," she began, her voice trembling only slightly at first, before steadying with each sentence that followed. "Thank you for allowing me this opportunity. I understand that what I am about to share will be difficult for some to hear, and perhaps difficult for others to believe, given how carefully my experience has been reframed by those with reason to obscure it. But I have decided that I would rather speak an uncomfortable truth than allow a comfortable lie to define my future any longer." She proceeded to describe, with a clarity and courage that surprised even herself, the years of gradual isolation and mistreatment that had defined her relationship with Damon. She spoke of the careful manipulation that had convinced her, for so long, that she was somehow responsible for failures that were never truly her own. She described, in measured but unflinching detail, the events of the night that had led her to send a desperate message to a stranger's phone, believing it might be the last thing she ever did. Throughout her testimony, Damon's composed mask began to crack, flashes of genuine anger flickering across his features as the careful narrative he had constructed unraveled before the assembled council. Several times, he attempted to interject, only to be firmly silenced by Marcus, who insisted that Elena be allowed to complete her account without interruption. When Elena finally finished, the hall fell into a heavy, charged silence. Several council members appeared visibly moved by her testimony, while others studied Damon with newly critical expressions, clearly reassessing the credibility of his earlier statements in light of what they had just heard. Marcus allowed the silence to linger for a long moment before speaking. "Thank you, Elena Voss," he said gravely. "Your courage in sharing this account has not gone unnoticed by this council." He turned to Damon, his expression hardening noticeably. "Alpha Ashford, do you dispute the account you have just heard?" Damon's composure had fractured entirely by this point, replaced by barely contained fury that he struggled visibly to control in front of the assembled leaders. "She exaggerates," he said tightly. "Every relationship faces difficulty. She was always sensitive, prone to dramatizing minor conflicts into something far more serious than reality." Elena felt a flash of the old fear at his dismissive words, the familiar pattern of having her experience minimized and reframed as personal failing. But this time, rather than allowing the fear to silence her, she felt something else rise up alongside it, a fierce and steady anger that had been building within her for years, finally finding its voice. "I am not exaggerating," she said clearly, her voice cutting through the tension in the hall with unexpected strength. "I have medical documentation of injuries sustained over months, verified by a qualified healer. I have witnesses who can attest to the fear I displayed in the days immediately following my arrival at Blackthorn, and I have my own voice, which I have reclaimed after years of believing it did not matter. You may call it dramatization if that helps you sleep at night, Damon, but everyone in this room can see the truth clearly, even if you refuse to acknowledge it yourself." A ripple of quiet approval moved through several members of the council at her words, and Damon's face flushed with a mixture of anger and humiliation at being so directly challenged in front of his peers. Marcus raised a hand, calling for order, as murmurs began circulating among the assembled leaders. "This council has heard sufficient testimony and evidence to render a preliminary judgment," Marcus announced, his voice carrying the weight of formal authority. "We will retire briefly to deliberate further, but I will say now that the evidence presented today raises serious concerns regarding Alpha Ashford's conduct, concerns this council does not intend to dismiss lightly." As the council members rose to withdraw for deliberation, Damon shot Elena a look of pure venom, quickly masked when he noticed several council members watching him closely. Kane moved instinctively closer to Elena, positioning himself protectively between her and Damon's line of sight, though he said nothing, allowing his presence alone to communicate the message clearly. "This is not over," Damon muttered as he passed, his voice pitched low enough that only Elena and Kane could hear. "You will regret this humiliation, Elena. Both of you will." Kane's expression hardened at the thinly veiled threat, though he kept his response measured, unwilling to give Damon the satisfaction of an emotional reaction in front of witnesses. "Threats made before a formal council carry their own consequences, Ashford," he said quietly. "I would think carefully before making any more of them." Damon said nothing further, storming from the hall with Colin and his remaining advisors trailing uncertainly behind him, clearly unsettled by how thoroughly the hearing had shifted against their favor. Elena watched him go, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something other than fear as she observed his retreating figure. She felt, quite unexpectedly, a fragile but unmistakable sense of victory, the knowledge that she had finally stood before those with power to judge her situation and told her truth without flinching, without apology, without allowing his lies to stand unchallenged. Whatever the council ultimately decided, she thought as Kane's steady hand found hers once more, she had already reclaimed something far more important than any formal ruling could grant her. She had reclaimed her own voice, and with it, the first genuine sense of hope she had allowed herself to feel in longer than she could remember. The council's deliberations stretched across several tense hours, during which Elena and Kane retreated to a private antechamber adjoining the Great Hall, neither able to focus on anything beyond the weight of what had just transpired. Elena sat quietly on a small couch near the window, her hands still trembling slightly from the effort of speaking her truth so openly before strangers, with the power to shape her future. "You were remarkable," Kane told her, settling beside her with careful gentleness. "I have stood before that council many times over the years, negotiating matters of territory and trade, and I have never witnessed anyone speak with the kind of courage you showed today." Elena managed a small, tired smile, though exhaustion had begun settling heavily over her features. "I do not feel remarkable," she admitted. "I feel like I might collapse from how hard my heart was pounding the entire time. but I also feel something I have not felt in a very long time. What is that? Kane asked gently. Free, Elena said simply. Even if the council rules against me somehow, even if this does not resolve exactly as I hope, I said what I needed to say. No one can take that back from me now. For years I let Damon control every version of my own story that reached other people's ears. Today, for the first time, I told it myself. Kane reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers with the easy familiarity that had grown between them over the past weeks. That freedom belongs to you now, permanently, he said quietly. Whatever else happens, that much cannot be undone. They sat together in comfortable silence as the afternoon light shifted slowly through the antechamber windows, occasionally interrupted by Garrett or Priya checking in with updates or simple reassurance. Mira arrived at one point with warm tea and a plate of food neither of them had much appetite for, though Elena appreciated the gesture nonetheless, another small reminder of the community that had wrapped itself protectively around her in recent weeks. It was nearly evening when word finally arrived that the council was prepared to deliver its ruling. Elena's stomach twisted with anxiety as they made their way back into the great hall, though she forced herself to walk with her chin lifted, refusing to let fear diminish the resolve she had fought so hard to reclaim. Damon and his advisors had already returned to their seats, his expression carefully neutral once more, though Elena noted the tightness around his eyes that suggested the earlier confrontation had rattled him more than he wished to display. Marcus rose as the hall settled into attentive silence, a formal document in hand. This council has carefully considered the testimony and evidence presented today, Marcus began, his voice carrying gravely through the quiet hall. Regarding the matter of Elena Voss and the circumstances of her departure from Ravenswood territory, we find the following. He paused, allowing the weight of the moment to settle before continuing. The medical documentation presented by Blackthorn's healer, combined with the direct testimony of Elena Voss herself, establishes a clear and troubling pattern of sustained mistreatment, inconsistent with the explanation offered by Alpha Ashford. This council does not accept the characterization of these events as illness or exaggeration. A visible ripple of reaction moved through the assembled council members and advisors, though Marcus continued without pause, his tone remaining formal and measured. Furthermore, this council recognizes the fundamental right of any pack member to seek protection from harm, regardless of existing mate bonds or territorial affiliations. Alpha Whitlock's intervention, while unconventional in its execution, was justified by the urgent circumstances presented, and this council finds no grounds for censure regarding his actions that night. Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes, as the formal language confirmed what she had hoped for, but had not allowed herself to fully expect. Kane's hand tightened around hers, his own relief evident in the slight easing of tension across his shoulders. Regarding Elena Voss's future affiliation, Marcus continued, this council rules that she retains full autonomy to determine her own path forward, free from any binding obligation to return to Ravenswood territory or to Alpha Ashford's protection. Any future claim of mate bond or territorial obligation asserted by Alpha Ashford will require her explicit and freely given consent, which this council notes has clearly not been present in recent months, if indeed it was ever genuinely present at all. Damon's face had drained of color entirely by this point, his carefully constructed composure abandoned in favor of open, barely restrained fury. He rose sharply from his seat, drawing immediate attention from several nearby guards positioned discreetly around the hall's perimeter. This is absurd, he said, his voice rising with anger he could no longer contain. I am her mate. Pack law has recognized mate bonds for generations. You cannot simply dissolve that connection based on the emotional testimony of a woman prone to exaggeration and instability. Marcus turned to face him directly, his expression hardening with the authority of decades spent leading his own territory with fairness and wisdom. Alpha Ashford, he said firmly, this council has heard sufficient evidence today to conclude that whatever bond may have once existed between you and Elena Voss has been fundamentally broken by your own conduct. Pack law protects mate bonds built on mutual respect and care, not bonds maintained through fear and control. I would advise you to reconsider your tone before this council, given how thoroughly your credibility has already been called into question today. Damon's jaw clenched visibly, fury radiating from every line of his posture, though he seemed to recognize, even through his anger, that further outburst would only damage his standing further. He forced himself into a rigid, controlled stillness, though his eyes, when they finally settled on Elena and Kane, carried a coldness that sent an involuntary shiver down Elena's spine, despite the protective presence of Kane beside her. "This council's decision is final," Marcus said, his tone brooking no further argument. "Elena Voss is free to determine her own future without obligation to Ravenswood territory. This council further advises Alpha Ashford that any attempt to retaliate against Elena Voss or Blackthorn territory, in response to this ruling, will be viewed as a serious violation of pack law, subject to immediate and severe consequence." With that, Marcus formally closed the hearing, and the assembled council members began rising from their seats, several pausing to offer quiet words of respect to Elena as they passed, a stark contrast to the dismissive treatment she had grown accustomed to over years of enduring Damon's careful manipulation. Owen paused longest beside her, his expression warm with genuine admiration. "You showed remarkable courage today," he told her sincerely. "Whatever comes next for you, I hope you know that many of us in this room left with a great deal of respect for what you accomplished." Elena thanked him, still somewhat overwhelmed by the sudden shift in how she was being perceived and treated, the strange and welcome sensation of being seen, not as a burden or an inconvenience, but as someone worthy of genuine respect. As the hall gradually emptied, Damon lingered near the exit, watching Elena and Kane with an expression that had shifted from anger into something colder and more calculating. "You may have won today," he said quietly, as he finally turned to leave, his voice carrying just far enough for them to hear. "But do not mistake this for the end, Elena. I do not accept humiliation gracefully, and I have never been a man who simply walks away from what I consider mine." Kane stepped forward immediately, positioning himself firmly between Elena and Damon's retreating figure. "She was never yours to claim, Ashford," he said, his voice carrying quiet but unmistakable menace. "And any attempt to prove otherwise will be met with consequences far more severe than a formal hearing." Damon said nothing further, simply offering a final, cold look before departing the hall entirely, Colin and his remaining advisors trailing silently behind him. The tension that had gripped the room throughout the day slowly began to dissipate as the last of the Ravenswood delegation disappeared beyond the great doors. Elena exhaled a long, shaky breath, the accumulated exhaustion and relief of the day finally catching up with her all at once. Kane turned to her immediately, concern evident in his expression as he studied her pale face. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. Elena managed a small, genuine smile despite her exhaustion. "I think, for the first time in longer than I can remember, I actually am," she said. "Frightened by his threat, yes, but also, somehow, more hopeful than I have felt in years." Garrett approached them as the hall continued to empty, his expression carrying quiet satisfaction, mixed with lingering caution. "That went about as well as we could have hoped," he said. "Though Ashford's parting words concern me, he does not strike me as a man who accepts defeat gracefully." "I agree," Kane said grimly. "We will need to increase border patrols and remain vigilant in the coming weeks. Whatever satisfaction we feel tonight, I do not believe this conflict has truly ended." Elena listened to their exchange with a mixture of lingering anxiety and steady resolve, understanding clearly that Damon's threat should not be dismissed lightly. But she also recognized, with a clarity that surprised her, that she no longer felt entirely powerless in the face of that threat, the way she once might have. She had stood before a formal council and told her truth, had watched that truth reshape how others perceived both her situation and her own worth. Whatever Damon intended next, she would face it not as the broken, silenced woman he had left on that roadside, but as someone who had reclaimed her voice and had every intention of continuing to use it. That evening, as the compound settled into quiet after the day's dramatic events, Kane found Elena once more in the garden, watching the stars begin to emerge against the darkening sky. He approached slowly, settling beside her on the familiar bench, and for a long moment neither spoke, content simply to sit together in the peaceful aftermath of a day that had tested them both so thoroughly. "Thank you," Elena said finally, breaking the comfortable silence, "for standing beside me today, for believing in me even when I struggled to believe in myself." Kane turned to look at her, something warm and steady in his gaze that made Elena's heart flutter unexpectedly. "You never needed me to believe in you for your worth to be real, Elena," he said gently. "But I am grateful, more than I can properly express, that I was able to stand beside you while you discovered that truth for yourself." Elena studied him in the soft evening light, feeling the weight of everything they had endured together over the past weeks, settling into something that felt increasingly like the foundation of a genuine future, one built not on fear or obligation, but on mutual respect, and, she was beginning to admit to herself, something that felt remarkably like love. Whatever challenges Damon Ashford still intended to bring, she found herself facing that uncertain future with a courage and hope she had not believed herself capable of feeling again, sitting quietly beside the man whose steady presence had, in ways neither of them fully understood, saved far more than just her life that rainy night on the roadside. In the weeks following the council's ruling, life within Blackthorn territory settled into a rhythm that Elena had never dared imagine for herself. She continued her sessions with Sophia, though their focus gradually shifted from processing past trauma toward envisioning a future built on her own terms. She spent more time with Mira and the small circle of friends she had begun cultivating among the pack, discovering, slowly, that laughter and companionship could exist without the constant undercurrent of anxiety she had lived with for so many years. She also began, tentatively at first, exploring what her own interests and ambitions might look like outside the shadow of Damon's influence. She had once loved reading and writing, talents she had abandoned years earlier when Damon dismissed them as impractical distractions from her responsibilities as his mate. Now, encouraged by Kane's genuine enthusiasm and the pack library's extensive collection, she found herself rediscovering that old passion, filling notebook after notebook with observations and stories that had been waiting patiently inside her for far too long. Kane watched this rediscovery with quiet delight, finding himself increasingly enchanted by the woman Elena was becoming as she shed the protective armor she had built during years of survival. Their relationship had grown organically during this period, evolving from careful friendship into something neither of them could deny was deepening into genuine romantic affection, though both approached this development with deliberate patience, unwilling to rush something that felt too precious to risk damaging through haste. It was during a quiet evening walk through the Eastern Gardens, several weeks after the council hearing, that Kane finally found the courage to voice what had been building steadily within him for weeks. "Elena," he began, his usual confidence tempered by an uncharacteristic hesitance, "I would like to speak with you about something important, if you are willing to listen." Elena, sensing the shift in his tone, turned to face him fully, curiosity and something warmer flickering in her expression. "Of course," she said. "You know you can always speak with me openly." Kane drew a slow breath, choosing his words with the same careful deliberation he brought to matters of territorial diplomacy, though this conversation carried far more personal weight than any negotiation he had ever navigated. "When I found you that night," he began, "I told myself my only responsibility was ensuring your safety and recovery. I convinced myself that whatever I felt in that moment, the recognition my wolf experienced upon touching you, was something I could set aside entirely, until you were ready to consider it, if you ever were ready at all." Elena listened quietly, her heart beginning to quicken with anticipation of where this conversation was heading. "But these past weeks," Kane continued, "watching you heal, watching you rediscover pieces of yourself that had been buried for so long, watching your courage and resilience reveal themselves more fully each day, I find that what I feel for you has grown into something far deeper than simple instinct or recognition. I love you, Elena, not because fate decided we should be connected, though I am grateful for whatever force brought us together that night. I love you because of who you are, the strength you have shown, the kindness you extend even after everything you have endured, the person you continue becoming with each passing day." Tears gathered in Elena's eyes as she absorbed his words, overwhelmed by the sincerity and depth of feeling behind them. She had spent years believing herself unworthy of genuine love, convinced by Damon's careful manipulation that she was fortunate simply to be tolerated. Hearing Kane speak so openly and vulnerably about loving her, not out of obligation or fate alone, but out of genuine appreciation for who she had proven herself to be, touched something deep within her that she had believed permanently damaged. "I love you too," she whispered, the words emerging with a certainty that surprised even her. "I think I have known it for weeks now, but I was afraid to trust it, afraid that if I allowed myself to hope for something this good, it might somehow be taken away from me again." Kane reached for her hands, holding them gently between his own. "I cannot promise you a life free of challenges, Elena," he said softly. Damon remains a threat we must continue navigating carefully. Leadership brings its own complications and demands, but I can promise you this: whatever comes, you will never face it alone again, and you will never again have to shrink yourself to fit someone else's comfort. I want all of you, Elena, exactly as you are, exactly as you continue becoming. Elena felt something within her chest finally settle into place, a peace she had not believed herself capable of experiencing after everything she had survived. She stepped closer, resting her forehead gently against his, savoring the warmth and safety of his presence, in a way that felt entirely different from anything she had known before. I want to build a life with you, Kane, she said quietly, not because I need protecting, though I am endlessly grateful for everything you have done, but because being with you feels like coming home to a version of myself I had forgotten was possible. Their relationship deepened steadily in the days that followed, though both remained mindful of moving at a pace that honored Elena's ongoing healing, rather than rushing toward expectations that might overwhelm her fragile but growing confidence. Kane introduced her more formally to pack traditions and responsibilities, curious whether she might one day wish to take on a more official role within Blackthorn's leadership structure, though he made clear that any such decision remained entirely her own choice, free from pressure or obligation. Elena found herself drawn increasingly toward this possibility, discovering within herself a genuine interest in pack governance and community well-being that had never had room to flourish under Damon's controlling influence. She began attending select council meetings alongside Kane, observing carefully, occasionally offering thoughtful insights that impressed even the more experienced advisors present. Garrett, who had grown genuinely fond of Elena over the preceding weeks, found himself remarking to Kane one evening on the transformation he had witnessed. She has a natural talent for this, he observed, watching Elena engage thoughtfully with a group of pack elders, discussing resource allocation for the coming season. I would not be surprised if she eventually proves herself an invaluable partner in your leadership, not merely your mate. Kane smiled, watching Elena with unmistakable pride and affection. She has always had that capability, he replied. She simply needed the space and safety to discover it for herself. Not all news during this period was peaceful, however. Reports continued arriving periodically regarding activity along the Ravenswood border, suggesting that Damon had not abandoned his earlier threats despite the council's clear ruling against him. Scouts reported increased patrol presence, occasional probing incursions that stopped just short of open confrontation, and troubling rumors suggesting Damon had begun quietly building alliances with other territories sympathetic to his grievances. Kane took these reports seriously, maintaining heightened vigilance along Blackthorn's borders, while continuing formal diplomatic efforts to prevent the situation from escalating into open conflict. He shared these concerns openly with Elena, unwilling to shield her from realities that directly affected her safety, and she absorbed the information with a steadiness that continued to impress him, a far cry from the fear that had once defined her every reaction to potential danger. I refuse to let him steal this peace from me, she told Kane firmly during one such conversation, her resolve unmistakable despite the underlying concern in her expression. I have spent enough years living in fear of what he might do. I will remain cautious, but I will not return to living my life as though he still holds power over me. Kane admired this resolve deeply, though he privately intensified security measures around her regardless, unwilling to take any chances with the safety of the woman who had become so essential to his own happiness and sense of purpose. He knew, with the same instinctive certainty that had guided him to her on that rainy roadside months earlier, that Damon's threats should not be dismissed lightly, and that whatever confrontation still awaited them would likely test everything they had built together in the weeks since that fateful night. As autumn settled fully over Blackthorn territory, painting the surrounding forest in rich shades of gold and crimson, Elena found herself reflecting often on how dramatically her life had transformed since the desperate message she had sent believing it might be her final act. What had begun as a final, hopeless attempt to leave some trace of her existence behind had instead become the beginning of a life she had never dared imagine possible, filled with genuine love, community, and a sense of purpose that continued growing stronger with each passing day. Yet even amid this hard-won happiness, she remained aware that the story was not yet complete, that Damon's simmering resentment represented a threat that would eventually demand confrontation rather than continued avoidance. She found herself preparing, quietly and deliberately, for whatever that confrontation might ultimately require of her, determined that whatever came next, she would face it not as a victim clinging to survival, but as a woman who had reclaimed her strength and had every intention of protecting the life and love she had fought so hard to build. The confrontation Kane had anticipated for weeks finally arrived on a crisp morning in late autumn, when a border scout arrived at the main hall, breathless and urgent, reporting that a substantial group from Ravenswood territory had gathered at the eastern boundary, far larger than any previous patrol activity, their formation suggesting something far more serious than routine surveillance. Kane received the report while reviewing morning correspondence with Garrett, and the moment the scout finished speaking, both men rose immediately, years of shared experience allowing them to move into coordinated action without need for extensive discussion. "How many?" Kane asked sharply, already moving toward the door. "At least 30, the scout reported. Led by Alpha Ashford himself. They are not attempting to disguise their approach, Alpha Whitlock. This appears to be a deliberate show of force." Garrett's expression hardened with grim understanding. "He is finally making his move," he said. "After weeks of quiet maneuvering, he has decided direct confrontation suits his purposes better than further diplomatic entanglement." Kane's mind raced through possible strategies as he moved swiftly toward the training grounds where his warriors could be quickly assembled. "Sound the alert," he instructed Garrett. "I want every available fighter positioned along our border within the hour, but hold defensive formation only. I do not want this to become the war Ashford seems determined to provoke, unless he leaves us no other choice." As preparations accelerated throughout the compound, Elena found Kane in the midst of coordinating defensive positions, her expression carrying a mixture of fear and fierce determination that had become increasingly familiar over the preceding weeks. "I am coming with you," she said firmly, before Kane could even suggest otherwise. "Elena, this is dangerous," Kane began, though he recognized from her expression that argument would likely prove futile. "I know it is dangerous," she interrupted, her voice steady despite the obvious tension in her posture. "But this confrontation exists because of what happened to me, Kane. I will not hide safely within these walls while others risk themselves on my behalf. If Damon has come to reclaim some twisted sense of ownership over my life, then he should hear directly from me exactly how thoroughly that ownership has ended." Kane studied her for a long moment, torn between his instinctive desire to protect her from any possible harm and his growing respect for her determination to reclaim agency over her own story, even in moments of genuine danger. Finally, he nodded, understanding that denying her this choice would undermine everything she had worked so hard to reclaim over the preceding weeks. "You remain behind our front line at all times," he said firmly, "and if I give any order to retreat, you follow it immediately, without argument. Agreed?" "Agreed," Elena said, relief evident in her expression at his willingness to trust her judgment. Within the hour, Blackthorn's warriors had assembled along the eastern border, a formidable line of disciplined fighters standing in careful formation as the Ravenswood delegation came into view across the boundary line. Damon stood at the front of his own assembled force, his posture radiating barely contained fury, Colin positioned close behind him, alongside several other senior Ravenswood advisors. Kane stepped forward to the boundary line, Elena positioned carefully behind the front rank of warriors as promised, though close enough to witness whatever confrontation was about to unfold. "Ashford," Kane called across the border, his voice carrying clearly despite the tension thickening the air between the two assembled groups. "This show of force accomplishes nothing beyond confirming everything this council already ruled against you." Damon's expression twisted with barely restrained rage as he stepped forward to match Kane's position at the boundary. "You humiliated me before every alpha in this region," he said, his voice tight with fury. "You stole my mate, destroyed my reputation, and now expect me to simply accept these losses gracefully. I will not." "She was never yours to steal," Kane replied firmly, his voice carrying steady authority despite the tension of the moment. "She left because you gave her no reason to stay, no safety, no genuine care. Whatever you have lost, Ashford, you lost it through your own actions, not through any wrongdoing on my part or hers." Damon's gaze shifted past Kane, settling on Elena with an intensity that made her instinctively tense despite the protective presence of Blackthorn's warriors surrounding her. "Elena," he called out, his tone shifting suddenly into something almost pleading, a manipulation tactic Elena recognized immediately from years of experience with his shifting moods. "Come home. We can repair what has been damaged between us. I never intended for things to go so far." Elena felt the old fear stirring within her at the sound of his voice, the familiar pull of guilt he had cultivated so effectively over years of careful manipulation. But beneath that fear, something steadier and stronger had taken root in the weeks since her testimony before the council, and she found herself stepping forward, past the protective line of warriors, ignoring Kane's sharp intake of breath beside her. "There is nothing to repair, Damon," she called back, her voice carrying clearly across the boundary, steadier than she had believed possible given the pounding of her heart. "I spent years believing our problems were mine to fix, that if I simply tried harder, loved better, sacrificed more, things would improve. I understand now that nothing I did would have ever been enough, because the goal was never actually repair. The goal was control, and I refuse to return to that any longer." Damon's expression darkened further at her defiance, his careful mask of wounded pleading dissolving entirely into open, unrestrained anger. "You ungrateful creature," he snarled, taking a step closer to the boundary line, causing several Blackthorn warriors to shift instinctively into more defensive positions. "I gave you everything: status, protection, a place among Ravenswood's leadership, and you repay me by humiliating me before the entire region." "You gave me fear," Elena replied firmly, refusing to be cowed by his rising fury. "You gave me isolation and control disguised as devotion. Whatever status you believe you provided came at a cost I am no longer willing to pay." Kane moved to stand protectively beside her, his presence a steady anchor against Damon's escalating aggression. "This confrontation ends now, Ashford," he said firmly. "Elena has made her position clear, as has this council. Any further attempt to reclaim what was never rightfully yours will be treated as open aggression against Blackthorn territory, with all the consequences that designation carries." Damon's gaze swept across the assembled Blackthorn warriors, clearly calculating the odds of any physical confrontation succeeding against a force so thoroughly prepared and disciplined. Something in his calculation seemed to shift, his fury tempering slightly into cold, calculating restraint, as he recognized the impracticality of forcing a battle he was unlikely to win decisively. "This is not finished," he said finally, his voice low and controlled despite the fury still evident in his eyes. "But I recognize when circumstances do not favor immediate action." He turned his attention back to Elena one final time, his expression carrying a coldness that sent a chill through her despite the protective warmth of Kane's presence beside her. "You will regret this choice eventually, Elena. When Whitlock's attention inevitably shifts elsewhere, when the novelty of playing rescuer fades, you will remember this moment and understand what you threw away. I will never regret choosing safety and respect over fear and control," Elena replied steadily, refusing to let his final attempt at manipulation shake the resolve she had built so carefully over the preceding weeks. "Whatever happens between Kane and I in the future, I know with certainty that it will never resemble what I endured with you." Damon held her gaze for a long, tense moment before finally turning away, gesturing sharply to his assembled warriors to begin their retreat. The Ravenswood delegation withdrew slowly from the border, their formation dissolving into the surrounding forest as they made their way back toward their own territory, leaving behind a tense but unmistakable relief settling over the assembled Blackthorn warriors. Kane turned immediately to Elena once the immediate danger had passed, concern and admiration mingling in his expression as he studied her carefully for any sign of distress. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. Elena drew a long, shaking breath, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly beginning to fade, replaced by a profound sense of relief and accomplishment. "I think I am better than all right," she said, a small, genuine smile breaking through despite her exhaustion. "I finally said everything I needed to say to him, directly, without fear controlling my words. I do not know if he will ever truly accept what happened here today, but I know that I have said what I needed to say, and that matters more than his acceptance ever could." Garrett approached them as the remaining warriors began standing down from their defensive positions, his expression carrying quiet satisfaction mixed with continued caution. "That went about as well as we could have hoped, given the circumstances," he observed, "though I suspect Ashford's pride will not allow this humiliation to stand indefinitely. We should remain vigilant." Kane nodded in agreement, though his primary attention remained focused on Elena, whose composure throughout the tense confrontation had impressed him more deeply than he could easily express. "Agreed," he said. "But for today, at least, we have successfully protected what matters most." As they made their way back toward the main compound, warriors falling into formation around them, Elena found herself reflecting on how dramatically the confrontation had differed from what she might have imagined months earlier, when fear of Damon had defined nearly every aspect of her existence. She had stood before him, faced his anger and manipulation directly, and had not crumbled beneath the weight of it the way she once might have. Instead, she had spoken her truth clearly and firmly, protected not by hiding behind others, but by standing confidently beside them, her own voice as much a shield as any warrior's presence. Whatever future confrontations Damon's wounded pride might yet provoke, Elena felt increasingly confident in her own capacity to face them, steadied by the genuine love and support surrounding her within Blackthorn territory, and by the hard-won knowledge that she was no longer the frightened, silenced woman who had once believed herself powerless against the man who had caused her so much suffering. In the weeks that followed the tense border confrontation, quiet began settling gradually over the region, a fragile but persistent peace that grew stronger with each passing day. Reports from Blackthorn's scouts indicated a marked decrease in Ravenswood patrol activity along the shared border, and diplomatic channels, carefully maintained by Owen and several other allied alphas, suggested that Damon had turned his attention towards stabilizing his own territory, rather than pursuing further confrontation with Blackthorn. Kane remained cautiously vigilant throughout this period, unwilling to fully relax his guard despite the encouraging developments, but he also found himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, able to focus more fully on matters beyond conflict and defense. He devoted increasing attention to the life he was building with Elena, a life that continued unfolding with a richness and joy that still occasionally caught him by surprise. Elena, for her part, had settled fully into her role within Blackthorn territory, no longer merely a guest recovering from trauma, but an increasingly valued voice within the Pack's broader community. She had begun formally assisting with Pack governance matters related to community well-being, drawing on her own hard-won understanding of trauma and recovery to help establish new resources for Pack members facing similar struggles, whether from difficult mate relationships or other forms of hardship. Her writing, too, had flourished during this period, filling notebook after notebook with reflections on her own journey, stories that she eventually began sharing, with growing confidence, among the Pack's close-knit community. Mira had encouraged her to consider compiling these reflections into something more formal, a resource that might help other survivors of similar mistreatment recognize patterns they had not yet learned to see clearly in their own experiences. "I never imagined my pain might eventually help someone else," Elena confided to Kane one evening as they sat together in their now familiar garden, autumn leaves scattered across the pathways around them. "For so long I believed my experience was simply something to survive silently, something shameful to hide rather than share." Kane reached for her hand, admiration evident in his expression as he considered how far she had traveled since that rainy night months earlier. "Your experience, and everything you learned from surviving it, has become one of the most powerful gifts you could offer to others facing similar struggles," he said gently. "That transformation, turning pain into purpose, speaks to a strength I do not believe you fully recognize in yourself, even now." Elena smiled softly, leaning into his steady presence with the easy comfort that had grown naturally between them over the preceding months. "I recognize it more each day," she said. "Largely because you continue reflecting it back to me, patiently, consistently, until I finally started believing it myself." Their relationship had deepened steadily throughout the autumn months, evolving from careful, patient friendship into a partnership built on genuine mutual respect and deepening love. Kane had never rushed her, never pressured her toward milestones she was not ready to embrace, understanding instinctively that trust, once so thoroughly broken, required patient rebuilding rather than forced acceleration. It was on a clear evening in early winter, nearly a year after that fateful rainy night on the roadside, that Kane finally felt ready to formalize what had grown so naturally between them. He had spent weeks planning carefully, wanting the moment to reflect not grand spectacle, but genuine intimacy, a celebration of everything they had built together, through patience, respect, and hard-won trust. He brought Elena to the same garden where so much of their relationship had unfolded, now dusted lightly with the season's first snow, lanterns casting warm golden light across the quiet paths. Elena, sensing something significant in his careful preparation, watched him with curious anticipation as he turned to face her fully, taking both her hands gently in his own. "Elena," he began, his voice carrying the same steady sincerity that had first begun earning her trust so many months earlier. "When I found you on that road, I could not have imagined how thoroughly my life would transform through knowing you. I have watched you rebuild yourself from circumstances that would have broken many people permanently, and I have fallen more deeply in love with the woman you have become with each passing day. I do not offer this next question lightly, nor do I expect you to feel any obligation toward accepting it, but I would be honored, more than I can properly express, if you would choose to formally become my mate, not through fate's initial pull alone, but through your own free and deliberate choice." Tears gathered in Elena's eyes as she absorbed the weight and sincerity of his words, overwhelmed by how completely her life had transformed since that desperate night when she believed her final message might be the last trace of her existence anyone would ever find. She thought of the frightened, broken woman she had been then, and the strong, hopeful woman she had become since, surrounded finally by genuine love and community, rather than fear and isolation. "Yes," she said, the word emerging with a certainty and joy that filled her entire being. "Yes, Kane, I choose you, fully and completely, not out of obligation or fate alone, but because you have shown me, every single day, what genuine love actually looks like. I want to build the rest of my life with you." Kane's expression broke into a wide, genuine smile, rare in its unguarded joy, and he drew her close, holding her with a tenderness that spoke to everything they had built together through patient, careful trust. Around them, the quiet winter garden seemed to hold the moment gently, snow falling softly against the lantern light, a peaceful backdrop to a commitment built on far more than instinct or fate. Their formal bonding ceremony took place several weeks later, a celebration that drew together the full community of Blackthorn territory, alongside allied alphas from neighboring lands, including Owen, who had supported them so faithfully throughout their difficult journey. Elena's sister, Sophie, traveled from her distant territory to attend, tearfully embracing Elena with a joy that spoke to years of worried distance, finally bridged by hopeful reunion. Priya, who had tended Elena's injuries during those first difficult weeks, stood among the gathered witnesses with quiet pride, having watched this remarkable transformation unfold from its most fragile beginnings. Mira, Garrett, and the wider circle of friends Elena had cultivated throughout her recovery gathered close, celebrating not merely a formal bonding, but the full, hard-won journey that had brought two people together, through circumstances neither could have anticipated. As the ceremony concluded and celebration filled the great hall long into the evening, Elena found a quiet moment to step outside, drawn once more toward the garden that had witnessed so much of her healing and growth. Kane found her there shortly after, watching the winter stars scatter brilliant light across the clear night sky. "Do you ever think about that night?" he asked softly, coming to stand beside her. "About the message you sent, believing no one would answer?" Elena considered the question thoughtfully before answering. "Often," she admitted. "I think about how close I came to giving up entirely, how easily that message might have gone unanswered, how different everything could have been." She turned to look at him, her expression carrying deep gratitude mixed with quiet wonder. "But mostly, I think about how something as simple as a stranger choosing to care, choosing to answer when he had every reason to ignore an unfamiliar number, changed the entire trajectory of my life. I do not believe I will ever fully understand why fate chose that particular night, that particular message, to bring us together, but I know I will spend the rest of my life grateful that it did." Kane wrapped his arm gently around her shoulders, drawing her close against the winter chill. "I have asked myself the same question many times," he admitted. "Why that message, out of everything, struck something so deep within me that I could not ignore it. I do not have a complete answer either, beyond the simple truth that some connections, however they begin, are simply meant to be nurtured once discovered." They stood together quietly for a long moment, watching the stars, surrounded by the fading sounds of celebration drifting from the hall behind them. Elena thought of the desperate, broken woman she had been on that rainy road, certain she had nothing left to offer the world, and felt profound gratitude for the journey that had carried her from that darkest moment into this one, standing beside a man whose love had helped her rebuild not just her safety, but her entire sense of self-worth. The road that had once seemed to lead nowhere but toward despair had instead led her here, toward a life rich with genuine love, meaningful purpose, and a community that valued her, not despite her struggles, but because of the strength and compassion those struggles had ultimately helped her discover within herself. Whatever challenges the future might still hold, Elena faced them now, not as a woman defined by fear and survival alone, but as someone who had proven, through her own hard-won courage, that even the darkest nights could eventually give way to genuine, lasting light. And as Cain drew her closer beneath the winter stars, sealing their commitment with a tenderness that spoke to everything they had built together, through patience and trust, Elena finally allowed herself to believe, completely and without reservation, that the home she had found within Blackthorn territory, and within the steady, loving heart of the man beside her, was hers to keep for the rest of her life.